Hi, welcome. I'm Eleanor, and this is the first video of a series of 5 that will be discussing the 5 shortlisted poetry books for the Forward Prize. This one is Pilgrim Bell by Kaveh Akbar. Now, what do I know about Kaveh Akbar? What do I know coming into this? Well, I heard about him when his first book came out, Calling a Wolf a Wolf. And I remember I was visiting the US at the time, and I went ahead and bought the book. And at the time, it really wasn't for me. I saw that it was quite dark subject matter. A lot of it was about his struggle with addiction. And at the time, I just didn't feel like reading that. But he has been in the news, in poetry news, ever since I can really remember, ever since I became interested really in American poetry. He had an interview series called Dive Dapper, in which he interviewed poets, and it's an excellent series. I think I listened to almost all of the interviews. So then, while I was in the US visiting family, I was in New York, and I happened to see that Akbar was giving a short, one evening workshop at Poet's House. So I attended that, and I really loved it very much. His personality is very warm, very welcoming, and he presented us with an honest version of how he often starts his poems. And this is the exercise he gave us, and I think it's a good way to introduce his book. He said, go to a library bookshelf at random and pick out, let's say, 10 books, all different books, completely random. Bring them back to your desk. Then at random, start opening them and set yourself tasks. For example, you'll only take words that are at the very bottom of the page on even pages, or you'll only choose phrases, but they have to have the letter A in them, or something like that. It was basically what he was teaching us was that as a poet sitting down and wanting to write, you have a very limited vocabulary within your own world, within your own personality. And you're never going to be able to access words, vocabulary, language outside of that unless you start to do something. Now, of course, that might be going for a walk and listening to, overhearing other people in cafes or things like that. But this is a great way to start yourself off and then to challenge yourself by saying, okay, I'm going to write this poem, but I have to use 10 out of these words or 6 out of these phrases. And that immediately starts you going in a completely different direction. You might still be thinking of whatever you had planned to write about. You are still your own person, and it's not like you're stealing material because it's tiny linguistic nuggets. It's just a word or a phrase that's out there in the world to be used. So he said that he often does that. And he, at the time, I'm sure he's changed by now, it's been years. I think it was 2017, maybe 2018. He says he rarely sits down and just writes without some sort of prompt like that. So then when you come to this book, you really have an introduction, I feel, of sorts. He is a writer who uses a lot of different language from many different sources and adapts them to his own use. And what that will often create is a sense of disorientation, because here are metaphors, similes, what sounds like perhaps symbols, and even syntax that doesn't quite make sense when you read it within your own linguistic bubble. That's a hard thing to get past if you're a reader of poetry who enjoys order rather than chaos. And I would say that this book, Pilgrim Bell, is bursting at the seams. It's very intense. It feels like a hyperactive kind of poetry to me, where the speaker is clearly Kaveh Akbar, and his personality comes out as someone who is extraordinarily driven towards a metaphysical discussion by way of extreme angst about everything in his life, especially being a poet, especially poetry. He's constantly, unsuccessfully striving towards some sort of meaning, some sort of goal that is as large as the world itself, including all the gods, including all the religions, including all personalities, geographic locations. And with the poetry, he does that with the forms. So I counted 13 different forms that he uses within this book. And when you flip through the book, you can really see to me, it seemed like Crazy Town, because I opened one book and there was a concrete poetry, which is what this is. Then I opened, and then I went to another page and I saw, he uses double spacing in lines. Another page, and I see that he has aligned the poem with the right margin instead of the left. And while doing so, he has done some kind of golden shovel method, which I've discussed before in a previous video, where if you take the words going down the page, it actually says a sentence. Apart from that, there are sonnets. There is a mirror poem, which drove me completely crazy. I had to, hold it in front of the mirror. It felt like the fun house in the world of poetry as far as form goes. Then, of course, I must mention that there are 6 poems called Pilgrim Bell, and each one, scattered throughout the book, each one has this use of the full stop in a very unnatural way. So if I were to read the first Pilgrim Bell, it would be read like this: dark on both sides makes a window into a mirror, a man holds his palms out, etc. Now, to me, coming to the poetry book, all of these forms were huge obstacles, because I found them to be extraordinarily irritating. I felt that they were gimmicky. I had to work much harder than I felt I wanted to read this book. Now that it's a few days later and I've gotten used to it, I admire his ingenuity. I admire Kaveh Akbar's ingenuity, and I see what he's doing, and it is very much the Kaveh Akbar method within this book. You're not going to get a book like, for example, I just picked up a book by Merwin, and as luck would have it, it was a perfect antidote for this book, because Merwin's garden poems, which I just picked up on a whim from a bookstore the other day, has these perfectly square or rectangular poems that all follow a very similar style. And it allows me to relax and really enter the world. It doesn't have that disjointed element that Kaveh Akbar does. But of course, you know, every poet is different. So let's say you've gotten past the form. Then there's the idea of Kaveh Akbar as the poet. I cannot at this point talk about a speaker in these poems as I might in other books. A lot of my teachers have taught me that the person speaking through the poem is not necessarily the poet. In this case, oh yes, it's absolutely the poet. I feel that very strongly. That being the case, Kaveh Akbar has a reputation that precedes him. He's very popular in the world of definitely American contemporary poetry, highly, highly regarded, much loved. I have read that he's an excellent professor, adored by his students. And he has so much passion and drive in the way he attempts to come to terms with his position as an American. He was born in Iran and came as a child, I believe, at around the age of 4. And in some ways, similar to other poets I've discussed who have had that dual language to contend with, he is very honest in his poems about the way he's divided between the Persian side of him and the English-speaking American side of him. And then, of course, there's his engagement with the politics of the moment that is always just under the surface of his poems, and sometimes it actually becomes more obvious, but mostly it's the subtext of his poems. So that also informs my reading of this book because, as I've mentioned earlier as well, I love myself a poet celebrity, and I will not give up on that love. And Kaveh Akbar, you know, at some point he writes, I wanted to be Keats, and in one of his poems in this book, and he laments the fact that he doesn't write at all like Keats whatsoever. But then again, Keats's celebrity persona has persisted. And in that sense, why can't Akbar really be seen in a similar way? So now to the actual guts of the poems. What is being written here? What are the themes? What is being discussed? Well, I don't think that anything constructive can come out of trying to paraphrase these poems. The most constructive thing I can tell you, if you are interested in jumping into Kaveh Akbar's world, is that he's constantly striving for meaning and for understanding and for peace of mind. He never gets there. And so it becomes a performance. He's performing each poem to us, the readers, and pointing, with one hand, he's pointing to what he's striving for, which is absolute meaning, absolute existential knowledge, and a direct ability. He's striving for a direct ability to describe religion, God, spirituality, the meaning of life. Kaveh Akbar is going for the big stuff. But as he's doing it, he's very much the performer. And with the other hand, he's pointing to himself. There's a lot of ego in this book. It's a huge ego in the book. He's pointing to himself and his poetry, and he's saying in the most fantastic, egotistical self-deprecation, which is something I've seen quite a bit in poets. And I don't have a problem with it. I kind of enjoy it as entertainment. So he's pointing to himself in his poetry, and as he's striving for the big stuff, he's saying, but oh, I am only tiny Akbar. I am nothing. Our existence is nothing. And this poetry, it doesn't do anything. I can't get there. It's impossible. Of course, he's saying it in his own language, and there I go, I'm paraphrasing, of course. But there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of ego and meta energy in this book. I don't think you can read this book without feeling passionate. Now, I think that will take you in two directions. You might be immediately put off, be too much, too much, snub your nose at it and move on. That's your prerogative, absolutely. On the other hand, you might immediately love it and think to yourself, I finally found my contemporary spiritual mentor, my poet, who's going to admit that poetry should deal with the meaning of life and the meaning of spiritual existence. And this is my guy, this is my poet. I, at the beginning, to be 100% honest, which I promised from the start, absolutely loathed this book. I would never in a million years have ever continued reading this book, if not for the fact that I'm highly motivated to read generally contemporary poetry now and talk about it. But of course, it's been nominated, it's on the short list for the Forward Poetry Prize. And I really want to follow that prize. I just decided to, and I told you, BookTube, that I was doing it. So how do I get from a feeling of loathing to a feeling of understanding, and I would go so far as to say affection for this poet and this book? I think it's through a lot of work frankly, on myself. And that is what is so wonderful and so freaking tedious about poetry. Unless you find a poetry book that's written exactly for you, which happens sometimes, occasionally, it feels like this poetry book has been written for me. This is my thing. Unless that is the case, you're going to have to do some work to get something out of it. And I really did work, while at the back of my mind, I had that that really honest little angel saying, but you don't like it, and maybe this is absolute crap. And just because he's popular doesn't mean you need to like him. And I'll admit his popularity and the fact that he was, that he's a, really highly respected poet, and, and all, it makes a huge difference, of course. Also, I think this is a good time to bring up the what happens when you do research into a book, because I think for all of the books of poetry I've read, I eventually do a lot of deep diving research into what others have written or said, plus podcasts and interviews about the book. I like to do that after I've come to my own conclusions, because otherwise it really muddies the waters. And I really want to have my own voice in this. So with Kaveh Akbar, I found, and I'll link the articles, I found mostly the most exuberant, absolutely 100% positive reviews of this book. It feels like every reviewer has a crush on Kaveh Akbar, has a crush on this book, had no difficulty in reading it. There was only praise. And then I came across one article by another critic that was rather scathing. And I will link to that article, William Logan. And I agree with what that critic has written. And I felt vindicated in a way, because here was a professional reviewer who also didn't like the book, like I didn't like the book. But then I've already done so much work on myself in this book that I've also seen much more in it that Logan didn't see and wasn't able to perhaps really access in the book for whatever reason. He's a reviewer. Reviewers aren't paid to do work on themselves. They're paid to review books objectively. Most reviewers nowadays don't. He does, and I really, really respect that, and I love that article. So that being said, I'm going to keep this all in mind as I continue reading the next book in the series. And I hope that, and if you have read Kaveh Akbar, please make a comment, because I'd love to know if any of my viewers have their own views. Okay, thank you very much. Don't forget that the only property is the property of the mind, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.